That night men died, without leaving a single trace they had ever been alive there. There is a type of military operation that doesn't aim merely to defeat the enemy, but to completely erase the very existence of the confrontation. A kind of mission where success isn't measured by bodies on the ground, but by their absence. Where silence is worth more than any declared victory. And what if I told you that, in the Falklands, there was a night when an entire encampment simply ceased to exist? No witnesses, no records, no explanations, just fragments of something no one was ever able to piece back together. What really happened in that absolute darkness? How can soldiers enter, execute, and disappear without leaving evidence behind? And even more disturbing, why are some operations designed to never be acknowledged? Before you understand that, you need to go back to the beginning of that night, when the silence still seemed like just silence. If you want to understand what truly happens in the shadows of war, the things that never make it into the books, go ahead and like the video now and subscribe to the channel, because here, some stories shouldn't exist, but they do. There was no final briefing, no motivational speech, none of the scenes you see in war movies, someone looking his men in the eyes and telling them they'd make it home. There was only movement, silent, calculated, invisible. Hours before anything happened, they were already there, crawling between soaked rocks and peat fields, inch by inch, in the total darkness of the Falklands. No moonlight, no stars. Just the cold cutting through their gear, the mud clinging to their faces, and the controlled breathing of men trained to disappear inside the war itself. It wasn't improvisation. It was method. Every movement calculated, not to shift a stone, not to snap a branch, not to make the slightest sound that could reach the ears of someone awake just a few meters away. They could be 5 meters from a sentry, and he would never know. This wasn't exaggeration. It was the result of years of training designed for exactly this kind of situation. Infiltrate, observe, act, disappear. That was the signature of the Special Air Service. Not the brutality, though it would come, not the speed, though that would come too. It was the invisible, the ability to be somewhere before anyone realized someone could even be there. Ghosts with surgical training, too present to be an accident, too absent to be detected. There were 2 versions of what happened that night. In one, the helicopter barely touched the ground before shadows were already jumping out, the rotors still spinning as the first men hit the soil and vanished into the darkness. In the other, there was no helicopter at that moment. They had already been crawling across the terrain for hours, slow and patient, like predators who know time is on their side. Both versions can be true at the same time, because SAS operations rarely have a single entry point, a single angle, a single line of approach. What the sources make clear is the result. By the time the camp realized someone was there, it was already too late for it to matter how they had arrived. The target that night was an improvised Argentine camp hidden among the hills, used as a resupply and rest point for troops. A functional place, without glamour, without major structural defenses, tents, vehicles, equipment. Men resting between shifts. Officially a logistical depot, unofficially something London simply did not want to leave intact. The difference between those 2 descriptions is where the whole story lives. Because a logistical depot has a legal status under the international law of war. It is a legitimate military target, attackable within established rules, recordable in reports, documentable. But what London did not want, left intact, did not need records. It did not need formal justification. It did not, in fact, need anything beyond men capable of doing the job, and an institutional silence capable of swallowing whatever those men did. And the men who were there, they slept, believing they were temporarily safe, far from the hottest front, protected by the geography and the deep night of the Falklands. That belief, reasonable human, completely understandable, was their greatest weakness. Not a lack of weapons, not a lack of training. The belief that that night would be like the others, cold, long, and uneventful. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a gunshot. It was the silence. A sentry simply stopped responding. Another soldier went to check. He never came back. No alarm was raised. No warning reached the rest of the camp. No voice lifted, no alert shot fired, no sign that anything had changed in that early morning darkness. Because by then the British were already inside. There was no more time for warnings, no window left for collective reaction. The perimeter, that invisible line separating safety from danger, had already been crossed in silence, without a trace. The first tent was opened without urgency, as if haste were an unnecessary luxury for those who already had complete control of the situation. A blade, a clean movement, precise, cold, then another and another. There were no screams. Death was smothered before it could even exist. Each silent elimination was, in itself, an act of communication, not with the victim, but with the rest of the camp that still slept, still breathed, still believed it was safe. The silence was the message. No one will know. This wasn't excessive violence. It was protocol. The SAS trains silent elimination as a standard for denial operations, missions where the objective is not just to neutralize the target, but to ensure no one knows the target was ever neutralized. The knife didn't replace the firearm due to lack of ammunition. It replaced it because the sound of a shot, even suppressed, carries information. And information was the one resource the British could not afford to let escape that night. But silence doesn't last forever. One soldier woke up. Maybe it was a different sound. Maybe the absence of a sound that should have been there. Maybe just the instinct of someone who had spent enough time in a war zone to know, without being able to explain, that something was wrong. He saw a shadow over him. He tried to scream. Too late. And then everything exploded at once. What had been invisible turned into pure violence in a matter of seconds, as if a floodgate had been opened and everything held back by hours of patience and restraint was suddenly unleashed. Bursts of heavy weapons tore through the camp. Machine guns ripping through tents, wood, bodies without distinction. The sound echoed across the hills as if the earth itself were being forced open. Grenades were thrown into enclosed structures. Short, sharp explosions, final. Men ran without direction, stumbling in the dark, unable to understand where the attack was coming from. Some never even saw the enemy. They rushed out of their tents into the chaos outside without being able to process what was happening. No reference, no coordinates, no orders. Others did see, and wished they hadn't. The SAS operators advanced without hesitation, as if they already knew exactly where each man would be. Switching between heavy fire and close-quarters combat with an almost mechanical coldness. No pause, no hesitation, not the slightest sign that the chaos around them affected them in any way. When ammunition wasn't necessary, the knives came out, fast, direct, merciless, intimate in a way a burst of gunfire could never be. No hesitation, no emotion, just execution. One Argentine soldier tried to flee through the rear. He didn't make it 5 steps. Another raised his hands. There was no negotiation, no pause for assessment. The order wasn't to capture, it was to erase, and to erase meant leaving nothing behind that could later tell what had happened there. No structure, no equipment, no testimony. A group tried to organize resistance near a light-armored vehicle. They didn't have time. A burst tore through the engine, followed by an explosion that lit up the entire scene, revealing for one frozen second mud-covered faces, empty eyes, and men being cut down before they could even react. Then, darkness again, and more gunfire. The fighting lasted only minutes, but the damage felt like hours, days, or something that didn't fit into any reasonable measure of time, because what happened there didn't have the texture of a battle. It had the texture of an extinction, fast, methodical, complete. The kind of thing that happens when one side knows exactly what it's doing and the other never even had the chance to understand what was happening. When the last shot echoed through the hills and silence settled back over the camp, something changed in the operators' behavior. They didn't pull back, they didn't celebrate, they didn't rest. They started to work. And that work, silent, methodical, as invisible as their arrival, was perhaps the most important part of the entire operation. Because an SAS mission doesn't end when the last target falls. It ends when there is nothing left to prove it ever happened. And what came next was not an epilogue. It was the mission within the mission. The war after the war. The systematic erasure of everything that night had been. There is a moment in certain military operations that does not appear in any openly distributed manual. It is not taught in conventional academies. It is not discussed in press briefings, not cited in published reports, not celebrated in decoration ceremonies. It is the moment when the battle ends and the real work begins. Not the work of winning, that was already done, the work of making it disappear. The SAS operators did not run out of the camp when the last shot echoed through the hills of the Falklands. There was no urgency of the kind that drives men with fear. There was urgency of the kind that drives men with method, the cold precision of those who know that every minute matters not for survival, but for the completeness of the mission. And the mission was not yet complete. They worked, quickly, methodically, without haste in individual movements, but without any hesitation in sequence. Each man knew what to do. Each man knew where to go. This was not post-battle improvisation. It was protocol. The second phase of an operation that had been planned from the beginning to have two phases, elimination and erasure. Because for the SAS, and for London, a denial operation is only complete when both phases are complete. To win without erasing is to leave evidence. And evidence was the one outcome this mission could not allow. The first target of the post-battle work was equipment, radios, communication systems. Anything capable of transmitting, recording, or storing information was destroyed with surgical precision, not merely disabled, destroyed in a way that made it impossible to recover, analyze, or use to reconstruct what had happened there. That detail matters more than it seems. A broken radio is still a radio. It still has a recognizable shape, still carries manufacturing marks, can still be traced to a specific unit, in a specific place, at a specific time. A radio destroyed the right way is nothing, just fragments, unrecognizable metal, another piece of debris in a field that would soon be full of them. The difference between disabling and erasing is the difference between leaving a question unanswered and making sure the question can never even be asked. Vehicles were compromised. Structures still standing were brought down or set on fire. Any configuration that could suggest organization, that could indicate that this place had been a functional Argentine operational point, with men and routines and hierarchies, was dismantled. The objective was not destruction for the sake of destruction. It was narrative disorientation, to ensure that anyone who arrived later would be unable to reconstruct the sequence of what had happened, unable to distinguish what had been destroyed by the operation from what had simply deteriorated, been abandoned, or collapsed for other reasons. And then there were the bodies. This is the point where the story must be told clearly, without euphemism and without unnecessary dramatization, because what happened to the dead that night is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire operation. Not because of the violence itself, that had already happened, but because of what it reveals about the intent that surrounded it from the very beginning. The bodies did not remain where they fell. That sentence, as simple and direct as it is, carries enormous weight, because bodies where they fall are evidence. They are coordinates. They are names that can eventually be identified. They are families that can eventually ask questions. They are governments that can eventually demand answers. They are records that can eventually reach courts. Bodies that disappear are none of that. Some were moved, repositioned in ways that would not suggest the real sequence of events, so that, if found, they could not tell the story of what had happened through their placement, their wounds, the direction of their bodies. Others simply vanished amid controlled explosions and the fire that came afterward. Not as an accidental consequence of battle, but as part of the protocol. There is a moment, in certain military operations, that does not appear in any openly distributed manual. It is not taught in conventional academies. It is not discussed in press briefings, not cited in published reports, not celebrated in decoration ceremonies. It is the moment when the battle ends and the real work begins. Not the work of winning, that was already done, the work of making it disappear. The SAS operators did not run out of the camp when the last shot echoed through the hills of the Falklands. There was no urgency of the kind that drives men with fear. There was urgency of the kind that drives men with method, the cold precision of those who know that every minute matters not for survival, but for the completeness of the mission. And the mission was not yet complete. They worked, quickly, methodically, without haste in individual movements, but without any hesitation in sequence. Each man knew what to do. Each man knew where to go. This was not post-battle improvisation. It was protocol. The second phase of an operation that had been planned from the beginning to have two phases, elimination and erasure. Because for the SAS, and for London, a denial operation is only complete when both phases are complete. To win without erasing is to leave evidence. And evidence was the one outcome this mission could not allow. The first target of the post-battle work was equipment, radios, communication systems. Anything capable of transmitting, recording, or storing information was destroyed with surgical precision, not merely disabled, destroyed in a way that made it impossible to recover, analyze, or use to reconstruct what had happened there. That detail matters more than it seems. A broken radio is still a radio. It still has a recognizable shape, still carries manufacturing marks, can still be traced to a specific unit, in a specific place, at a specific time. A radio destroyed the right way is nothing, just fragments, unrecognizable metal, another piece of debris in a field that would soon be full of them. The difference between disabling and erasing is the difference between leaving a question unanswered and making sure the question can never even be asked. Vehicles were compromised. Structures still standing were brought down or set on fire. Any configuration that could suggest organization, that could indicate that this place had been a functional Argentine operational point, with men and routines and hierarchies, was dismantled. The objective was not destruction for the sake of destruction. It was narrative disorientation, to ensure that anyone who arrived later would be unable to reconstruct the sequence of what had happened, unable to distinguish what had been destroyed by the operation from what had simply deteriorated, been abandoned, or collapsed for other reasons. And then there were the bodies. This is the point where the story must be told clearly, without euphemism and without unnecessary dramatization, because what happened to the dead that night is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire operation. Not because of the violence itself, that had already happened, but because of what it reveals about the intent that surrounded it from the very beginning. The bodies did not remain where they fell. That sentence, as simple and direct as it is, carries enormous weight, because bodies where they fall are evidence. They are coordinates. They are names that can eventually be identified. They are families that can eventually ask questions. They are governments that can eventually demand answers. They are records that can eventually reach courts. Bodies that disappear are none of that. Some were moved, repositioned in ways that would not suggest the real sequence of events, so that, if found, they could not tell the story of what had happened through their placement, their wounds, the direction of their bodies. Others simply vanished amid controlled explosions and the fire that came afterward. Not as an accidental consequence of battle, but as part of the protocol. How does a man speak about something that, according to the records, never happened? How does he describe a night that exists in no document, an operation with no official name, deaths with no record? He cannot point to a report and say, "This was it." He cannot show a photograph, a map, a signed order. All he has is memory, and memory without documentary corroboration is just a story a man tells about himself. A former operator once said in a low voice, during a conversation that should never have existed, "We didn't leave questions, because we didn't leave anyone to ask them." That sentence is not a confession of guilt. It is not the outburst of someone overcome by remorse or the need to be understood. It is a statement of methodology, delivered with the same coldness an engineer would use to describe the logic of a structure he designed. The tone is not horror. It is precision. And perhaps it is exactly that tone, more than any detail of the operation itself, that reveals how deeply that logic had been internalized. How erasure was not seen as something disturbing, but as a natural and necessary part of the job. Another summed it up with the same economy of words, staring into nothing. We were never there. 4 words. A statement that, depending on how it is read, can be understood as cover, as pride, as protocol, or as the most honest possible summary of a mission whose central objective was precisely that, to never have been there. Not as a side effect, as the result. The weight of these phrases, spoken years later in conversations that should never have existed, lies in what they reveal about what it means for a man to carry a memory that the state says does not exist. The dissonance is not only political or legal, it is existential. You lived something. You know what happened. You carry it in your body, in your reflexes, in the silences that appear when certain questions are asked. And at the same time, there is an official version of the world in which it simply did not occur, in which you were never there, in which the men who died that night did not die that way, or perhaps did not die there, or perhaps there are not enough records to say anything with certainty. What happens to a man who lives in that fracture, who wakes up every day knowing something the official world says never happened? That is a question blank reports will never answer. Because blank reports were created precisely so that question would never need to be asked. The military concept behind all of this has a name: plausible deniability, a mission in which the tactical objective is inseparable from the ability to deny that the mission ever occurred, where success is not measured only by what was destroyed or neutralized, but by the absence of evidence that could reconstruct what was done. It is war within war. Not between 2 armies, but between what happened and what can be proven. And in that second war, the weapons are not rifles and grenades. They are silence, blank paper, and men trained not to exist. On that dawn in the Falklands, both wars were won. The first in minutes, with weapons, blades, and controlled explosions. The second in the hours that followed, with method, protocol, and the coldness of those who understand that erasing is just as important as acting. And when the last man boarded the helicopter and the Falklands returned to the silence and fog that had always covered them, the settlement no longer existed as evidence. It existed only as absence. And absence, for a state that has decided certain things do not need to be recorded in order to happen is exactly the desired outcome. There is a human tendency to measure the brutality of war by its visible traces, by the bodies, by the wreckage, by reports that tally casualties as if numbers could translate what truly happened on a battlefield. But what happens when there are no traces, when there are no bodies to count, no wreckage to photograph, no reports to archive? What happens when the operation itself was designed not only to kill, but to erase the very fact that someone was killed? That is the question that Dawn in the Falklands left behind, not in documents, not in official records, but in the kind of silence that weighs more than any confession. Because the true signature of that mission was never the violence. It wasn't the machine guns tearing through tents in the dark. It wasn't the blade flashing for a second before ending a life. It was what came after. The methodical, cold, almost bureaucratic work of destroying not just a camp, but the very possibility that the camp had ever existed. Equipment destroyed, communications eliminated, bodies that did not remain where they fell. Some moved, others simply erased amid controlled explosions and fire. When the last operators boarded their way back, what remained was not a battlefield. It was a void, a place where something had happened, but there was not enough proof left to explain what. And perhaps that is the hardest part to process. Not the cruelty of the operation itself. War is, by definition, an exercise in institutionalized cruelty. But the precision with which the British state turned that night into nothing. The most powerful weapon of that mission was not fired by any SAS operator. It was signed by someone sitting at a desk in London, and it was called silence. What this reveals about modern war. There is a fundamental distinction that is rarely taught in history classes. The distinction between declared war and denied war. Declared war has rules, it has protocols, it has the Geneva Conventions, war correspondence, post-conflict trials, truth commissions. Above all, it has witnesses, because the very existence of witnesses is part of what gives legitimacy to the conflict. Denied war has none of that. It exists in the space between what states do and what states admit to doing. And the Falklands, to the global public, was a declared war. There was media coverage, there were debates in the British Parliament, there were officially counted casualties on both sides. There was, in the end, a victory that Margaret Thatcher used to solidify her political position at a time when her approval ratings were falling. But inside that declared war, there was another one. One that moved in the dark, without flags, without identification, without warning. One that would appear in no report, that would trigger no investigation, that would produce no witness capable of describing what truly happened in that dawn among the frozen hills. And here is the point that must be stated clearly. This was not an accident. It was not an unintended consequence of an operation that went out of control. It was the objective. They don't need evidence. Not as negligence, not as disorganized brutality, as methodology. The erasure of evidence did not happen despite the operation. It happened as part of it. It was as planned as the infiltration, as precise as the shots, as essential as any other tactical element of that night. And that changes everything about how we understand what was done there, because when a state plans not only an action, but the disappearance of the action itself, it is making a philosophical decision before any military one. It is deciding that certain deaths do not need to be recorded in order to happen, that certain lives do not need recognition to be taken, that truth, in that specific piece of reality, belongs exclusively to those with enough power to erase it. The men who carry what does not exist, there is something official reports can never capture, something that not even institutional silence can fully erase. The weight that remains in the men who were there. Years later, veterans would speak about that night, but never completely, always in fragments, always in low voices, always with that particular quality of someone describing something they know should not exist. And, for that very reason, don't quite know how to name. A former operator once said, during a conversation that should never have happened, we didn't leave questions because we didn't leave anyone to ask them. Another was even more direct, colder, as if coldness were the only language left to describe it. We were never there. Think about that sentence for a moment. We were never there. It is not a denial of guilt, not an attempt to escape legal responsibility. It is a statement of ontology, a claim about what exists and what does not, about what is real and what has been decided cannot be real. These men were there, they saw what happened, they did what they did, they carry it somewhere inside them, in the details that surface at 3 in the morning, in the reactions the body keeps even when the mind tries to forget, in the particular kind of silence that settles when someone asks a question too close to the truth. And at the same time, officially, institutionally, bureaucratically, they were never there. There is a specific kind of violence in that which is rarely discussed, the violence of being instructed to exist in one reality, while the state that sent you operates in another, of carrying a memory that public authority says does not exist, of being at once living proof of something and the official denial of that same thing. There is no Geneva Convention for that kind of damage. No truth commission for what happens inside a man when the state erases what he lived. When silence is policy. The Falklands War ended in June 1982, with the Argentine surrender and the British retaking of the islands. History books recorded the battles of Goose Green, Mount Longdon, Wireless Ridge. They recorded the ships sunk, the aircraft shot down, the names engraved on memorials, but there is an entire category of events that history books simply do not record. Not because historians are negligent, but because the documents that would allow such records were classified, destroyed, or never existed at all. And here is the question that goes beyond the Falklands, beyond the SAS, beyond 1982, beyond any specific conflict. When a state decides that certain truths do not need evidence to exist, and that certain deaths do not need records to happen, who ultimately decides what is real? Because the obvious answer is, whoever has enough power to write or erase history. And that should disturb us far more than it does. Not because operations like that are necessarily illegitimate within the logic of war. That is a complex ethical debate with valid arguments in multiple directions. But because the systematic erasure of real events creates a kind of parallel reality where power operates without friction, without accountability, without even the possibility of a question being asked. They don't need evidence. That sentence, whispered among operators in a dawn in 1982, is in fact a precise description of how power functions when there is no one left to challenge it. It does not need evidence. It does not need justification. It does not need recognition. It only needs to happen and then disappear. The wind that takes everything. At dawn on that morning in the Falklands, the wind had already begun to carry away what remained. Ashes, fragments, silence. The patrols that arrived later found only scattered ruins and confused signs. Nothing that could tell a complete story. No witnesses, no survivors capable of telling it. Only doubt. And perhaps that is exactly what makes that night so difficult to close with a clean conclusion, because clean conclusions assume that there is a complete truth available to be accessed. And here, there isn't. What remains are fragments, low-voiced accounts, sentences spoken in conversations that should never have existed, the kind of evidence that exists precisely because it was designed not to be enough, And perhaps that is the most honest lesson that operation left behind, that there are forms of violence the world will never fully process, not because they are unimaginable, but because they were designed to exist in that exact space where human memory remains and official record does not. The cold of the Falklands is still there. The hills remain. The wind still blows, and somewhere between what happened and what was allowed to be known, that night is still there too, as if it never ended, as if, in some way, it never even began.